So this is lecture 7 in John, Contemplative Theologian. There's no doubt Jesus presented substantive dilemmas to the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes, for those who were acutely aware of who he was, Herodians. He was making claims that came as an affront to their very understanding of Judaism, even though in his time Jews differed on how their heritage was to be interpreted. They did agree that there were certain interpretations that were not valid and not acceptable. I sometimes think if I lived at that period of time, I would have found it very, very difficult to accept the claims Christ was making for two reasons. The first would be theological and exegetical. As a Jew, I would have been warned from my birth, from taking in with my mother's milk, that no one should ever make images of the divine, because any image which by its very nature is finite cannot express, define, comprehensively embrace the infinite. So any finite image borders on idolatry, because it's making of the infinite something finite. And so here Jesus comes along and he claims as a finite human being to embody the infinite God. And so as a Jew, my very upbringing would warn me against, at a literal level, making images which are finite, which cannot express the infinite. But then a human being comes along and claims in a finite form to embody the infinite. Well, this would, to me, at an exegetical, theological level, be the height of idolatry, the height of madness, someone who comes and makes these claims. And so my very conditioning as a Jew would be an affront. The second would be a political one, objection to who Christ was, in that there had many, part of the Jewish genetic code is a belief a Messiah will come. Was that it's a political Messiah, a military Messiah. Someone was going to come and save them from the perils, the injustices, the wars of their time, and bring in the new Jerusalem, the new kingdom, the new paradise, which would reverse Eden. Now, many messianic figures had come along, and at the particular time Jesus came, Palestine was ruled by Rome, and Rome would brook no political military opposition. And so within the Jewish tradition, there was this longing at the time for, just as there was in their Egypt experience, in which they had been colonized by a pharaonic and Egyptian power. Rome was just the new Egypt in that sense. And they longed for liberation, they longed for freedom. And of course, they had the memory of the history when they were independent, they were sovereign under Saul, David, Solomon. And so the belief was that the Messiah would come and free them from another form of bondage, this time Roman bondage. Now, many messianic figures had come under Roman colonization. Rome was brutal with any opposition. Rome would allow the Jews to establish the temple, their liturgy, their debates about how the Torah was to be interpreted, the liturgies, the seasons. But beyond that, they could not be political and certainly organized politically or militarily. So, in a sense, you have the sanitization and domesticating of the Jewish tradition, and the other hand, the longing to be free from that domestication or sanitization. And so there was longings for messianic figures. Now, pre-Jesus' time, there had been a variety of men who had claimed to be ushering in the messianic kingdom, the new kingdom, the freedom of the Jews from Roman oppression. And inevitably what happened, of course, Rome stepped in, centurion guards, brutal. These people were put on crosses, crucified, and naive followers were crucified as well. And so anyone who came along making political claims, much less theological, exegetical claims about being the Messiah, most leaders within the Jewish community would have had members of their family, relatives who perhaps had naively followed these messianic figures and met tragic deaths. And so when Jesus comes along, if I was a member of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, my concern would be, is this just yet another pseudo-messianic figure claiming to deliver us from the bondage of Rome? But when push comes to shove, Rome will step in. Both the leader and the naive followers are going to be put on crosses, and that will end the rebellion, that will end the revolt, that will end the revolution. And so as a Jew at that time, I think any thoughtful Jew would have had theological, exegetical questions about Christ's claims, but also serious political questions about, if you say yes to this, what are likely to be the implications for naive followers chasing this Pied Piper who claims to be a messianic figure. Not easy. And when we move into John 10, which I will next micro lecture, we'll look at Jesus even more so as making these claims as the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd, he's using obviously the Lord is my shepherd from Psalm 23. So he's identifying himself very clearly with God. And this creates very pronounced reactions amongst the Jewish people. And yet the works he was doing, the ideas he was articulating, had the ring of integrity about them. So any thoughtful person at the time would have been torn between his interpretation of the tradition, the political implications of it, and yet there also was something profoundly insightful about his understanding of creating interpretive realities, stone houses as it were, and people who didn't buy into our agenda, how you stone them, blindness, and the nature of real seeing versus thinking we see but we're blind. And so from an anthropological perspective, there's a sense in which there is some subtle insights being articulated by Jesus about the human condition, about the human soul, about seeing and not seeing. And yet objectively, the claims he is making raise serious questions. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is look at the dilemma, both in Jesus' time, historically in our contemporary times, about whose interpretation of Jesus. Because this was a dilemma then, and it has been a dilemma throughout Western history, and it is a contemporary dilemma of whose interpretation or who speaks for Jesus. And so just as in Jesus' time, some saw him as a miracle worker, and of course crowds followed him because of that. Some saw him as an insightful rabbi who was speaking wisdom and insight that challenged the power elite in Jerusalem. Some saw him as a prophet. Some saw him as a priest. Some saw him as a potential king, a messianic figure. So just as in Jesus' time, and most of the early disciples were confused again and again about his claims, and it was their own journey of increasingly seeing in a clear, in a fuller and a more meaningful way who he was, and that was part of their own journey of unveiling, of seeing in a fuller manner what Jesus was trying to teach them, but again and again they would not get it. And even after his death and resurrection, they're in a process of seeing more and more with rinsed and clear eyes. But that's a journey for each of them in terms of a clear, a fuller, a deeper understanding. Now, within the Christian tradition, there has been a long history of different interpretations of Christ. We've got here a copy, of course, of Jaroslav Pelikan's very important work, probably all of you should read. It's called Jesus Through the Centuries, His Place in the History of Culture. And what Pelikan does within the 2,000-year-old tradition, he looks at almost 20 different interpretations of Christ. If I can use an analogy which I have previously of a mountain. A mountain has many sides to it, and depending on what route a person takes up the mountain, they're going to see different parts of the mountain. If a person decides to build a little acreage, a little home, chart out some ground on a mountain, and define where they're living as the definitive part of the mountain, Well, that's a way of shrinking the breadth, the fullness of the mountain to their acreage, or someone going up a mountain to the ridge and summit. As I said, they're going to see certain parts of the mountain, and they're going to miss other parts of the mountain. Well, the mountain of Jesus, as it were, both the various routes up, the ridges, the summit, depending on where a person is on their journey, they're going to see different parts of the mountain. And so Pelikan's book on Jesus through the centuries very, very much looks at how various people in their finite ways shrink the fullness of the mountain to their particular perspective. And a full understanding only comes when people are willing to approach the mountain of Jesus from a variety of sides, rather than shrinking their particular perspective and then defining it as the definitive view of Jesus. And so Pelikan's work is very, very important in that regards, and should be read for anyone interested in how the ideals of Christ can be shrunk to finite perspectives, but with the broad perspective of the mountain, they get a much fuller sense of who he is. In our contemporary sense, if we go from Jaroslav Pelikan, Jesus through the centuries, to some contemporary issues, often the debate is the debate between the historic Jesus and the divine Christ, and how can the two dwell in one body, and that's part of the Christological debate. But what I'd like to touch on now, briefly, it's to look at a variety of works that on the one hand are merely concerned with the historic Jesus. So for example, Albert Schweitzer's great breakthrough work, The Quest of the Historic Jesus, he tracks in his work all the different sort of scholarly works, in his case from a German tradition, that attempt to interpret who is this historic Jesus, how did he understand himself, and how did others understand what he was saying and doing. Schweitzer comes to the position in which Christ saw himself as a messianic figure bringing in the end times, the eschatological Jesus, or the apocalyptic. Apocalyptic meaning just revealing that which has been hidden. Eschaton meaning the word, the reflections about the end of time. And so this is Schweitzer's argument, arguing or suggesting in his work that Jesus was primarily an eschatological figure, a messianic figure, auguring in the end of time. But the problem, of course, is that time did not end. Time went on. History, the curtains of history did not close. So was Jesus deluded in who he thought he was, or was people like Schweitzer and those who follow that mistaken in how they're reading Jesus? Or are they just taking one, as it were, part of the mountain and claiming that's what the mountain looks like? There's been a variety of other books, not only the Schweitzer tradition, but many following in that ethos, but going in different directions. So you get Bart Ehrman today, who's very, very popular amongst many, arguing that some of the claims, for example, John is making in the book of John, are these really just John's superimposition and interpretation, overlay on Jesus, and making claims that Jesus seemed to have said, but was not really what Jesus said. And so there's a whole scholarly world afoot today of saying, who is the real Jesus? And were the Gospels, was Paul, many others, are they a generation after Jesus making claims about Jesus that Jesus did not really say, similar to what Plato doing with Socrates? So who is the real Jesus? Who is the real Socrates? So people like Bart Ehrman, and there's a whole liberal tradition of biblical higher, lower criticism that is making those claims. So Bart Ehrman will go in one direction. Dominic Crossan is going to go, no, not so much the eschatological. Jesus was a political revolutionary. He was a zealot. And so unlike Bart Ehrman, Dominic Crossan is going to take the political read versus the eschatological read. Both are serious biblical scholars, but come to very different interpretations. Then there's the whole Jesus seminar tradition, of which N.T. Wright was very engaged, and with another important moderate liberal biblical scholar in terms of whose version of Jesus. And the Jesus seminar was very popular for about 5 years, but as in all fashion shows, whether sort of literal fashion shows of clothes, so intellectual interpretive fashion shows, the Jesus seminar came and went. And so meanwhile, the story of Jesus ever continues. So there are all these people who come along and claim their interpretation is the legitimate read of Jesus, and other reads are problematic. Very similar to, as I mentioned, people setting up their little acreages on the mountain or people going up mountains. Inevitably, these fashion shows, the interpretive fashion shows, they come, they go, and the biblical text remains. But people can become very much entranced and titillated by interpretive fashion shows that have their moments, they have their season, they come, they disappear. And so the whole Jesus seminar was a part of that as well. Earlier was, what would Jesus do? Okay, so someone like Caputo is coming along, very important philosopher actually, he'd done a lot of work on Heidegger, and he comes out of a historic tradition of, well, what would Jesus do in certain, well, that then raises the question, well, whose understanding of Jesus and what Jesus would do? And we're back to, again, these finite attempts by people to interpret an infinite fullness and mystery of that sense, because there is certainly a mystery in the sheer breadth and depth of who Jesus was. And so the quest for the historic Jesus goes in one direction. The other is more interested in the divine Christ, and so books like Matthew Fox, The Cosmic Christ, or Richard Rohr, The Universal Christ. There's also a whole movement today arguing that the biblical texts repress the Gnostic Christ, the wisdom Christ of the Gospel of Thomas, and there's many other here's. When I was doing my undergraduate studies, I was fortunate at the university, I was at some of the top Gnostic scholars, or one of them anyway, from the Nag Hammadi finds of Egypt, and the whole Robinson collection of the Nag Hammadi texts, which seem to bring out a whole range of texts that are not found in the New Testament canon of the Gnostic Jesus, the Jesus who very much was not included in the New Testament. And the argument of these Elaine Pagels and this whole tradition itself was that the early New Testament writers domesticated Jesus to serve a certain interest, hence the Gnostic texts were excluded. Now, of course, anyone who does a study of the Gnostic texts, either the crude or more sophisticated ones, knows there were reasons they were excluded, and some of this romanticized Gnosticism, when actually bored into at a little more substantive level, gives genuine reasons in terms of why those texts were not included, but this isn't a presentation on Gnosticism or the Nag Hammadi text itself. So what you have in the divine Christ, you get these notions of the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ, the Gnostic Christ, the Sophianic Christs, that attempt to look at the divine nature of his revelations, his insights. And so the question then, when we get to, say, for example, John 10, is who is the real Jesus, the Christ, the historic Jesus, the eternal Christ, the two in one? How did the many councils and creeds attempt to make sense of that? But the point to note here, and to stay close, is that in the whole area of biblical criticisms and para-biblical texts and criticism, there is this tendency to take limited interpretations and then absolutize those interpretations, and then there's this scholarly debate about whose version of Jesus and the differences between that. And inevitably the key point to note is not to be trapped or ensnared or entombed in any of these trendy seasons of interpretations because inevitably they pass away like a season, and some new scholarly work is going to come along, some new scholar who's going to argue this was the real historic Jesus, or this is the real cosmic universal Christ. That season, that book will pass away, and new people will come along. And so the perennial fragmentary interpretations each have their day, but because none are comprehensive, best to recognize what's the good of these interpretations, while recognizing all of them are finite perspectives and something which transcends the partisan interpretations. And that's why Pelikan's work probably is a lovely interpretation into these diverse reads, while recognizing that the real Jesus the Christ transcends all these human attempts to freeze limited interpretations, shrink Jesus to a moment of interpretation, and thereby missing the fullness of the real Jesus the Christ. I will turn in my next lecture to John 10, the Good Shepherd, and look at what Jesus is doing even at the Feast of Dedication, and what shepherd really means in that larger sense, and what Jesus is doing with the metaphor of shepherd, just what he was doing with the metaphor of stone and blindness itself.